Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 812. In this week's SPaMCAST, we speak with Brad Micklea, founder and CEO of Jozu. We talk about the professionalization of AI and machine learning, the topic of machine learning operations, MLOps, and why agile is integral to getting work done. Brad is the founder and CEO of Jozu and a project lead for the open source KitOps ML project, a tool set designed to increase the speed and safety of building, testing, and managing AI and ML models in production. That's that professionalization thing. This is Brad's second startup, his first. CodeEnvy, the market's first container-based developer environment, was sold to Red Hat in 2017. In his 25-year career in development tools and DevOps software market, he's been the GM for Amazon's API Gateway and built open and closed source products that have been leaders in Gartner's Magic Quadrants. In his free time, he enjoys cycling, reading, and vintage cars. Are you ready to consider the professionalization of AI and ML models? It's time for the interview. Brad Micklea, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thanks for having me, Tom. I'm excited.
I always enjoy these sort of podcasts where we talk maybe a little technical, maybe hit a few things because that are more entrepreneurial in nature. My read of the market these days is a lot of, a number of my listeners over the years have pointed out that they're going to do a startup and things like that, but they're still in the trenches doing work when we're having. So finding role models for them, I think, is sometimes, valuable, or at least hearing the stories. Brad, why don't we start with, MLOps and, what is it and why do we care?
It's a good question, Tom. So MLOps is essentially ops for machine learning, and definitely kind of borrows its title from the success of DevOps. Mm-hmm. Personally, my opinion is that MLOps is a bit of a misnomer, especially right now. When you look at the MLOps tool market, and there are well over 1,000 tools there, open source and proprietary, the majority of them really focus on development of models, which makes total sense given where we are in the kind of popularity of AI. I won't say in the history of AI because AI is actually quite old, but in the popularity, the general consumption of AI, we are at a very, very early stage. And most people are at the stage where they're just learning about AI. They're learning about ML. They're developing things. They're playing with things. They're kind of tinkering. In that context, they need tools that help with that dev side. These are similar to, what we think of as an IDE, libraries, frameworks, virtual machines, all that kind of stuff that you would use in a normal software project early on. Where MLOps tools tend to not have a great deal of maturity is in their tooling for handling a production environment. And those of your listeners who have been on both sides of that fence, the dev and the production side, will know they are radically different. On the dev side, a lot of things you can be kind of loose with, and you're aiming for speed, iterative smoothness, that kind of flow state. And in production, you're aiming for security and compliance and robustness and 5 nines. And those things don't usually result in high speed, high iteration, great deal of smoothness and low friction. And so you have ML ops tools, and the thing I don't like about the name is that it's got that ops part in it. But in fact, a lot of these tools have, for example, a button called, deploy to production or something similar. And the reality is that button doesn't exist in dev tools for most software because it's an insane idea. You don't want people randomly firing things into production just because they can. So, there's little things like that I think are just show a little bit of the immaturity, the naivete of where the ML ops actual function is right now.
So are we actually describing the professionalization of machine language, generative AI, that kind of stuff, becoming more of a professional, get it in production and run it such that it doesn't blow your face off?
Yes, that's exactly it. I think the latest data that I saw was roughly 5% of AI projects are in production right now, with about another 23 odd percent that are on their way to be productionized, if that's a term, which probably not. But yeah,
it is now.
It is now. That's right. It is. So that's really, I think, the crux of where we're at right now. So for the last I'm getting old. 7 years, I would say. Part of my role in the groups that I've led, I've had a kind of team working on AI or ML, and specifically moving that work into production to work with production microservices that we had. And it was definitely a big wake-up call right from the beginning to see how quickly the data scientists could create a model and how that worked. It accomplished its goals. And then how long it took to make that model appropriate and safe to be run in production, to be deployed, to be patched, to be secured, to be compliant. That was a real surprise to me, because coming from normal software, typically you're used to, once the software is written and it's complete and it does the job, it's a relatively short period of time it takes to really package it for production, especially thanks to containerization and Docker and all these things that have happened since then. But even rewinding before that, it still didn't seem to take that. But in fact, that development of the model today, I feel like represents about 30% of the way through the journey, not 70% of the way through the journey. I think that that's an easy thing for people who haven't yet played with this process all the way through to misunderstand.
Given the level of difficulty or the amount of effort on the other side of building the model, what would you guess as to the amount of models that are in production running that would probably not be the most well-tempered beasts, so to speak?
Well, I think that that's the other crazy thing that it took me a long time to kind of wrap my brain around this. And I think everybody's going to have to go through this kind of mental shift, especially if you've grown up with software. One of the things you know about software that you've kind of taken for granted as a deep, deep foundation for everything you do is, if you put the same input in to a correctly written program, you will get the same output out. That's how they work. Models are not like that. You can put the same input in 10 times and you will probably get 9 or 10 different answers. They'll be basically the same, but they're not going to be exactly the same. So things like testing, things even just like understanding, is it working or not, monitoring, is not nearly as straightforward as it would be for that kind of deterministic world.
Yeah. Once upon a lifetime ago, I was a tester, ran testing departments early in my career. And very frankly, I look at that and I go, ooh, that would, well, it would be interesting, but it would be really hard to know. And then again, because I see people shipping or putting things into production that attach to these large models, I'm not 100% sure that I would suggest that they are that rigorously tested or that they're that rigorously secured.
Yeah, so I think that the good news here is that the whole industry around AI is moving forward at leaps and bounds, at incredible speed. Having been in the software world for 25 years, I have never seen progress this large, this fast happen any other time. It didn't happen this fast with the internet. It didn't happen this fast with mobile. It's really, really impressive. So I think, yes, today, we're still trying to figure out the best possible way to repeatedly test these things, the best possible way to secure them. Not to mention anything of the ethics. You got to work around some of that stuff, the ethical boundaries, which we have not had to think about much before. So there's a lot to do. But one of the things, and actually coming back a little, to your intro a little bit, Tom, is as an entrepreneur and as someone who's also run large scaling businesses like Amazon's API Gateway, one of the things that I've always believed is when something is hard, when something is uncertain, the smartest thing you can do is start working with it now. Don't wait. because you learn so much more by working through that uncertainty, by working through those challenges than you ever could by reading about how to do something from somebody who themselves went through that. Like somebody's got to go through it. It's not going to magically solve itself. If you're one of those people, you will be such a league ahead of your peers, of your competitors. And so I think that's the irony right now, is that Gen AI is incredibly powerful. I think most people believe, and I won't just say Gen AI, let's just say, ML and AI, incredibly powerful, very game changing. But I think it's one of those things where everyone's got to decide for their own business, for themselves, do I want to be at the forefront of this? Do I want to be kind of at that leading edge? Maybe not the leading edge, but somewhere near the leading edge. Or am I okay to follow? And this is one of the few areas where I would say it's actually better to be closer to the leading edge. Normally, as enterprises, you want to be more in the following camp. But I think when something comes along that's this revolutionary, you don't want to hang around and wait for all your competitors to figure it out first.
No, because at that point, you probably won't be around. If it is that radical. We use the terms ML and we use the term AI, Gen AI, whatever, and we use those sort of ubiquitously. How do you distinguish between those two things?
Yeah, first of all, I should say I'm not an expert. I'm not a data scientist, so I'm not going to give you I'm probably not going to give you a very right answer, but I can explain to you how I think about it, having kind of worked adjacent to these worlds and managed these teams for a while. ML, I think of as being, and how do I describe it? I guess, more constrained. It's more about solving a specific problem to me, more tailored perhaps. And then generative AI is, well, partly in its name, it's generative. It's meant to create new. And that part is quite the part that people kind of seen since OpenAI and been like, wow, that's kind of magical with ChatGPT. That is meant to be very, very general, very, very broad. And so typically, like, for example, the first data scientists I worked with in 2017 when I was a VP at Red Hat, they were solving very specific business problems that we had or that our customers would have, and ways that could be solved much better, much faster, much richer by having a model do it than by having somebody manually kind of look through all this data, or even a computer system, look through the data without the benefit of a larger model. That brought huge value to ourselves as a business and to our customers. But it was still very constrained. It was answering a handful of questions, the same questions for everybody using the same type of data. Very different than ChatGPT, which is ask me anything and I will give you an answer.
An answer.
Yes.
Well, I don't know. I used, I used Gemini today to actually to come up with a title for a podcast. Why not? Yeah. To see what it came up with. Many of the SPaMCAST listeners, and that's what it gets shortened down to, are in the business, obviously, but also work with agile methods, whether it's Scrum, Kanban, Lean, just a wide gamut of them. Does that make sense in the world of data science?
I think it absolutely does. In fact, I would almost argue that because many of the principles of agile in some ways have come from science, I think it's very natural for data scientists to operate this way. I think all the data scientists I've known have been always thought very iteratively. They've thought in terms of experiments. They've understood that if you're going to run an experiment and it's going to fail, it's better for it to fail now than fail 2 weeks from now, or 5 weeks from now. And so I've loved working with them because they've got that same mentality. So absolutely, I think it works. However, and this is going to change based on the type of model you're working with. But let's say you are doing something with a larger scale model, some kind of Gen AI, Llama 2, Llama 3, whatever have you. The amount of time it takes to tune those, to train them, to run pipelines through them is definitely longer than it normally takes to do something with a piece of deterministic software, which is typically an order of magnitude simpler, at least. And so that, I think, may take a little bit of getting used to. For me, certainly, the shift from doing what I call like traditional ML, where the work could typically fit into a standard 2-week sprint, let's say, to Gen AI where the work didn't fit as cleanly into that, because if it takes, 14, 16 hours to run a job, you're not going to get a ton of jobs run in the course. So it just depends, I think, a little bit, but conceptually, I think it works very well.
And I was sort of interested in terms of how would fit with things like, and I'll throw some, gasoline on the fire and say, fixed artificial boundaries, the sprint that Scrum uses. When, it is at times discovery, or whether, these things can be an individual piece of work can be extremely large. So what I'm hearing is the application of the principles and the ideas, and whether you look at it as a big box of Lego and steal bits and pieces out is probably it's highly useful. How about DevOps?
So. Yeah, so DevOps, I think that also is very useful, and I think that speaks back to that professionalizing or productionizing of a lot of this work. I think it is important for folks to understand and remember that data scientists are scientists. They're not engineers. They didn't choose to be engineers. And so...
Well, we'll teach them.
There you go. And so, what they finish is really a prototype. And that is very different than saying it is a production-ready piece of code. It is a prototype, and it needs to be massaged and changed and prepped and packaged for that next step. I personally believe that those MLOps tools we see, that 90% of them, I would say, are probably going to be great dev tools that will be used in AI/ML for years and years. But I don't think that they really are a logical or responsible replacement for the DevOps tools we've built, which genuinely do have typically ties into compliance, ties into security, that understand the kind of constraints that a production environment has to work under when you're targeting 2 nines, let alone 5 or 6 nines. So that's in some ways, I think, where like the open source project that I've been working on really focus with KitOps is we really tried to find a way to allow all the development to happen with the tools that it needs to happen with on the ML side with those data scientists. They can still use their Jupyter notebooks. They still use their ML flow or whatever they want. But then how do you get the artifacts from that into the DevOps tools? And that's tricky. It's not simple because the DevOps tools have all been built essentially based on an assumption of, for example, Git being the source of truth. And Git works really, really well for a lot of small files, which is what most repos are. They're tens of thousands of tiny little files. But that's not what the artifacts for an AI project look like. The AI project artifacts are a massive serialized model, often tens, if not hundreds of gigabytes in size. Not something that you can store easily in a Git repo. Data sets, which are also hundreds of gigabytes in size. You've got hyperparameters and configuration that is stored in these specialized ML tools, which are not very friendly necessarily to folks who do not understand AI/ML. So how do you take all these different pieces, none of which really, other than the code, fit really nicely into Git? You can use something like Git LFS, and then you've got kind of a pointer in Git that gets updated and points to something which is in a different repository somewhere else. But that's not great because somebody can still muck with the thing that you're pointing to, and you maybe don't realize, and that's not what you really want, especially when you're talking about deploying things to production.
The whole idea of AI is evolving quickly. At what point do you actually foresee it becoming more of a mainstream tool where all of these production, people are used to production kinds of systems, and that's just part and parcel of how the work gets done?
I think it's actually going to come very quickly. Most of the enterprises I talk to are aggressively working with AI and models. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Most of them have been working with models, ML models, these kind of more constrained, very specific things, for years and years. And so they do have a good basis of experience in this. Now they're starting to work with larger scale AI, like Gen AI, and that will take some time, but they're moving fast because they all recognize the massive efficiency, productivity, effectiveness gains that can come from harnessing the power of that AI properly. And most of them think the way I mentioned earlier, get out in front of it, learn it the hard way, because then you're still going to be way ahead of your competitors. Don't wait around and see what's going to happen and hope that it all turns out well. So I don't have a crystal ball, but my guess is somewhere between 2 and 5 years, this will be a scenario where most people are just used to at least seeing AI kind of moving through their environments, and it's in production and it's in staging and it's in dev, and we're updating this and we're maintaining that and we're retiring this one because it's gotten too old, and that will be just like any other software lifecycle.
If we were that far in the future, what would a typical AI team look like?
That's a great question, Tom. So one of the things that I see happening right now that I think is a mistake is people trying to create a kind of pure AI team and segregate it off from the rest of the engineering team. It's tempting to do that, and I understand why, because it is a very specialized skill that if relatively few have, and that right now is being used in a very constrained kind of narrow part of the whole production environment. And so, sure, let's have some specialists do it. Ultimately, I don't think that's the right move, because what we've already seen, I feel like since, when was it, 2022, I think, or 2021, when ChatGPT first launched. And I remember being in an airport, in fact, and playing with it on my phone and going like, wow, this thing is wild. And now it's only a very short period of time since that. And you've got many, many people in the normal workforce, just as normal workers, who are using, just like you did today, using ChatGPT to help them write something or edit something or generate fake data for their testing or, whatever you have you. And it's great at doing those things. And that's moved very, very quickly and very broadly. You can see it's kind of spreading out with almost every month. You hear new use cases, new ways that people are gaining by using this stuff. And I think that's going to be the same thing in production for these businesses. By squirreling that away into one little group, you make it easy for everybody else to kind of ignore it. And I think you constrain the positive impact they can have. So I feel like I got lucky in some ways, because 2017, 2019, when I started working with these data scientists, it was not a very ubiquitous thing that just everybody understood and had. And so when I asked for a data scientist, they were like, okay, you could have two headcount. You've got 200 people and you can have two of them. And so as a percentage, it's a pretty small percentage of the team. In a weird way, it was great, because it meant that it would have been idiotic for me to say, okay, well, I'm going to have one AI department manager and then one person reporting to them. Like, no sane person would set that up that way. So they were just two data scientists, and they, as a result, joined our sprints, because where else was I going to put them? They joined our meetings. They joined our ops sites. Like, they were just there. And it meant that they got to know the product teams and engineering teams got to know them. They would chat. And then inevitably there'd be these great ideas that would come up, with people going like, oh yeah, we're struggling with this thing. And when the data scientists go, oh, do you have this kind of data? Do you have that kind of data? Yeah, we do. Oh, well, give it to me and let me see what I can do with it. And 2 days later, they have this amazing kind of rich answer out that the engineering team wouldn't have been able to get to in, 3 sprints. And then you start getting the impact kind of growing both vertically and kind of horizontally in the organization. And I think that's where the magic really starts to happen. So I think you've got to have maybe some kind of center hub to share the knowledge, sure. But you want these people embedded in your product team ultimately. And that's really where I think the real impact comes.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that's a phenomenal piece of advice. You have an interesting career. I spent a little time on your LinkedIn, but one of the things that sort of is sort of different is that you're currently managing an open source project while running a startup. Why?
Yeah, so I've I've kind of, I guess, somewhat grown up in the open source world, and I'm a big believer in the value of open source, not just because I think that all knowledge should be shared and open. So there's that kind of more ethical thing that sits there, but also just more, I guess, from a business perspective, I just see it as an amazing way to expose technology to a large number of people and quickly understand if that technology has value or it doesn't. You throw this thing out into the universe, and if people love it, they'll use it. And if they don't love it, they won't use it. And so as kind of the seed to a business, it's fantastic. Because one of the hardest things to do as a startup is you almost inevitably start with one idea and you get it wrong. And then you try something kind of adjacent to that you pivot over here and then over there, and then you eventually get it right. The faster you make those cycles or iterations, the faster you get to the thing that is going to grow. If you try and do that, hiding all that stuff behind closed doors and only pushing out a little bit as you think it's ready, what you're really doing is you're kind of, it would be like taking stills every 30 minutes in a movie and then asking people which part of the movie they like best. You might get lucky and you might get the right stills that people would go like, oh yeah, that's the part of the movie I like the best. But it's a lot more efficient really just to show the whole movie and have them say which part did they like best nonstop. And that's what you do when you're building in the open. Just everything is out there and people can see and touch every piece. And what I've typically found is that your audience, your users, your community will come to you and they will often in the form of issues. I can't get it to do this, or why doesn't it do that? Or how would I make it do this? Those are often the things, even though they're technically bugs, you look at them through the right lens and you say, ooh, that person is trying to do something really cool. So my last startup, we were a web IDE, the market's first containerized web IDE. And when we built it so you could use compiled languages, which at the time in 2015, you couldn't do compiled languages in any web IDE. They were all for interpreted languages. And so we were like, okay, this is great. You do compiled languages like Java. This is going to sell like hotcakes in the enterprise for doing Java development. And it didn't. It just didn't seem to take off. But we got an issue one day from this person going, hey, I'm trying to do embedded systems and I can't figure out how to load this particular driver in this particular way into the container in your environment. Help me out. And it would have been very easy for us to say, well, that's not Java and enterprise. And so, no, sorry, we're not going to do that because that's not what we're here for. But instead we looked at it and said, embedded systems, interesting. Those do seem like they would be hard to test. I bet you'd need to test a lot of things in parallel. And so maybe you would need a lot of these environments in parallel. And so maybe this is actually a really good use of a web ID. And in fact, that's really what originally very first took CodeNV kind of off the ground. And from there, then it did spread out into enterprises and doing Java, all the things that we thought it would do. But it took that seed from a completely different area that none of us had ever thought of to really launch things.
You recognize that. How did you learn to recognize that sort of opportunity?
I guess the most honest answer is I don't know, Tom. But I think
that's fair.
I will credit some of this to my peculiar upbringing. So my parents were both scientists, biologists, and chemists. And so I grew up in a household where everything that we did, like right from a young age, we would talk about A/B testing, and we would do blind tests of things, just as like we would have cereals and do blind tests of cereals to decide which ones we like better, for example. And so I grew up in this household where everything was an experiment, and we'd have a hypothesis and a conclusion. And so that was what I was like until I got into university and I decided I wanted to do English literature, which could not be further away from science, and philosophy. And so I did that. And I feel like that bent my brain in a completely different direction. And I feel like I've really benefited since then of having these two spheres of my brain kind of well fed, both the kind of science side and the deterministic side, and then the more kind of interpretive, kind of creative side. And so maybe there's an element of that there.
I generally, and especially with founders and people who have done this multiple times, love to ask when they decided to get rid of the keyboard. But I get the sense that you are still technically proficient and still technically active. At what point do you see having to give up the keyboard to scale an organization?
So I actually have had to do that in different jobs already. So definitely when I was running Red Hat's developer tools, developer program, developer marketing, basically all things developer at Red Hat. I remember it was like 250 people in that org. At that point, it's not healthy. It was not healthy for me to be directly involved in all these things. I don't want to micromanage these people. You have to hire people that you can trust, and then you've got to trust them. You've got to audit them, make sure that things are going well. Now what that didn't do is it didn't change my belief that I needed to be technically understanding all the elements of our business. And so I would sit with the engineers and try and get as far as I could down understanding what every one of our tools and products did, what the challenges were, how we solved them, why we solved them were better, all that stuff. And same thing on the marketing side. What campaigns were we running? Why were we running those campaigns? Why were we targeting that audience? I think you need to do that in order to be able to properly kind of check what people are doing. Because a good team will operate independently and make great calls. But a great team will also understand that they need to go to other people around them, including their boss, and sometimes their boss's boss and boss's boss's boss, and ask, what are we doing wrong? What could we be doing better? And the more prepared that person is to understand the context of that business, the better the advice that they will give. I saw that again when I was running API Gateway for Amazon, a 9-figure business, hugely critical to organizations. I needed to understand deeply enough what the product did that when it broke, because of course everything breaks sometimes, and there were very upset customers, I could speak confidently, clearly, and honestly about the technical aspects of what had happened that was right and the technical aspects that had gone wrong. That didn't require me to understand the code. I never looked at any of those code bases because it wouldn't have made any sense to me, I'm sure. But I did need to understand what it was doing and ask the right in order to ask the right questions to have it happen. It's fun though being back in a startup and actually being able to be and like be back to looking at the pull requests and being a little bit deeper. That has been fun, but at some point I won't have any issue in kind of stepping back when the need comes.
Over the years, I've talked to a lot of people that sometimes find it hard to recognize when that time needs to happen. And so they sometimes even struggle through it. I've seen founders, step back from the CEO level to CTO because they didn't want to give that up. Just, it's an interesting thought process along the way. If you woke up tomorrow morning and someone handed you your cup of caffeinated beverage of choice and a magic wand and said that you had the power to change any two things affecting development in this decade, what would those be and why?
That's a tough question. I actually I'm maybe going to be a little bit unpopular with this answer, but I actually like the idea of AI being able to write more and more code for us. The reason why I like that is because I have always thought of coding a product as being similar to when those great masters would paint a painting that was, 20 feet by 12 feet. You've seen those enormous paintings from that time in a museum. And what, some of your listeners, I'm sure will know, others may not, is that the accredited artist of that painting probably only painted 30, 40% of that painting. Maybe not even that. There was always apprentices that would be there to do the base point or, fill in the mountains in the distance. And then the artists themselves would focus on the parts that draw our eye, the faces, or, the particular way the light hits something. That's where they could have their greatest impact. That would allow them to focus, have that kind of sustained impact in that most critical area without having to worry about what was going to happen in the parts of the painting that are not as often looked at, not as critical. It also allowed them to grow others, into those roles. I feel like the habit that we've gotten into of measuring the quality of an engineer by the amount of code they write or how often they're coding is actually unhelpful.
Ouch. Yeah, I agree.
It is much more about what is the impact. And so, like my CTO, who I've known for like 15 years and worked with in a bunch of different places and times, he is actively using AI to help write some of the code that he's doing. And he's excited because it has allowed him to spend more of his day thinking strategically and architecturally about how do we make this system, scale faster, smoother, cheaper? How do we make it nicer for people to interact with? And he's not having to spend his weekends coding because he's thinking about that. He's able to get that done within a normal kind of work week. I think that's something that we should look forward to.
Okay, that's one.
Oh yeah. The other one is, and this I have to credit Amazon and my time at Amazon for this one. I always cared about security. I did not understand the depth of criticality of security until I was operating API Gateway. Being kind of at the front door of Amazon Web Services in many ways, we saw a huge amount of obviously attacks and bad actors. And understanding the depth at which a security mindset needs to be built into every engineer was a real wake-up call. It was not a coincidence that all of the best engineers I had on that team, and there were amazing engineers on that team, they all had an almost just like innate foundation in security. Now, it had been drilled into them in many cases through the way that Amazon works. But I think this is something that most engineers, understandably, because it's honestly annoying and painful, the security side, but it is so critical that it is one of those things now that I always look for in engineers when we're hiring is how much time and thought do they just automatically put into security as they're coding? Because it is very hard to bolt security on afterwards. It is trivially easy if you're building security in from the beginning to fix the little things that are going to go wrong. So that's the other one that I would love to see. I'd love to see AI helping with clearing away some of the less critical tasks. And I would love engineers to spend more time thinking about architecture and security than they probably are today.
Brad Micklea, this has been absolutely fantastic. If people wanted to continue the conversation, how would they go about doing that?
Well, you can reach me on Twitter, which I won't stop calling Twitter. Just first name, last name, just Brad Micklea. You can please check out KitOps, KITOPS.ml. That's the project for handling the packaging, the versioning, and the kind of handoffs of the AI and ML models in what I feel like is a proper DevOps flow, and in a way that allows you to store those within an OCI registry that, by the way, you've already got inside. So you don't need a lot of extra stuff. So I'd love people to check that out, give us feedback. Feedback is a gift. It's people's greatest gift. It's their time, which for all of us these days is kind of the thing that is most valuable. So any feedback we receive, we're always ecstatic to get because it shows that kind of love for the project. So please do check out KitOps ML and keep an eye out for Jozu.com because that's going to be what we build beyond that for the kind of next stage.
At this point, I open up the platform for you to promote anything that you'd like. The show's been on for 18 years. So something that'll age off before 18 years is probably the right answer.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I said, I mean, the main things that I'm working on right now are the open source KitOps project. I think if anybody is working with AI ML today, that is a great thing to take a look at. Yeah, I guess that's the main thing right there. KitOps ML. Yeah.
Super. This has been marvelous. I have very much enjoyed it. Thank you for spending time with the Software Process and Measurement Cast listeners.
Thank you. This was a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to any follow-on conversations that do come.
An advertisement. Learn to tame your work intake beast. Jeremy Willets and I are running 2 Mastering Work Intake cohorts over the next 3 months. Learn to solve IT's dirtiest secret, work intake. Stop ignoring it. Stop fixing it. By the way, the May 31st through June 28th cohort is now closed. Subscribed and closed. The next one will be July 12th through the 26th of July. Links in the show notes to register. Want to read the book first? Keyan Reid stated in their review of Mastering Work Intake, "What first struck me was the immediate tie to the human equation." Purchase a book. Links in the show notes. J. Ross Publishing or Amazon, either one. In Reread Saturday news, this week we consider consciousness in our reread of Flow. Consciousness is a process of interpreting and processing thoughts and feelings. Link in the show notes to this week and all of the other entries in Reread Saturday of Flow. In the next Software Process and Measurement Cast, we return to the topics of accountability and responsibility. Hierarchies generate a tangled web of overlapping relationships that can obscure who has the ball. This type of scenario might be good in sports, but in business, not so much. We'll also have a visit from Jeremy Barrio, the evolutionary agilist. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?